Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the event organized by the Center for Democratic Integrity, an NGO based in Austria that monitors and analyzes various attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence European politics and society. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov. I'm the director of this NGO. And today, it's a great pleasure to have Professor Roger Griffin as a co-host, I would say, of a discussion of the presentation that Professor Roger Griffin prepared for today. It's called Putin's Project Mayhem. And just a few words about Professor Roger Griffin. He taught at the Oxford Brookes University. I think this is where we first met in 2006 for a conference on clerical fascism. Roger is best known for the books Nature of Fascism, 1991, Modernism and Fascism, 2007, then Terrorist Creed, Fanatical Violence and the Human Need for Meaning, 2012, and some more recent works. He's a co-founder of the journal Fascism and also of the Association for the Comparative Fascism Studies. So, Roger, we have, I think, like a summary of your presentation, which I will now share.
Right. So it's very clear that I'm here not as a Russianist or an expert on Eastern European politics or whatever, but I've tried to rather to trespass from my own areas of study into looking at the politics of, in this case, Putin, but I do try to expand the idea. Just to remind you, if you haven't seen it, what I tried to do, I briefly characterize Putin's notorious style of rule, which is characterized by not playing the democratic game and playing dirty tricks and doing all sorts of things which are not part of the orthodox ways that nations are meant to interact with each other. I've tried to put in I think some of them quite funny cartoons, which also characterize Putin's politics as being illegitimate in terms of received behavior of major nation states in the international community, and the attempts to conceptualize Putin's politics using political concepts. And I base myself there very heavily on a, I think, brilliant article written by Anton that ends up with his own suggestion, which is the idea of malign politics. I bring in Machiavelli. I'm surprised that isn't used more, though it does crop up at times occasionally. And I do have, I think, a rather pregnant quote from the Prince, which seems to me to characterize a lot of the suspicion and deviousness of leaders. And this was being advocated by Machiavelli and the Prince. And I actually show that this idea of resentment as driving the, as it were, the calculated refusal to play the game fairly that you get in The Prince, this cynical idea of politics you get in Othello and more recently in The Joker. And I found it quite neat that Putin has actually been portrayed in a piece of satirical photo montage as the Joker. I then get more serious and heavy, as it were, by bringing in Nietzsche's concept of Ressentiment, uses the French, which he identifies and locates within his elaborate theory of slave morality versus master morality. And I then attempt an ideal typical definition of what I call resentment politics. And to get back away from the abstract into the world of literature and film, which I'm much happier with, I introduced Fight Club and Project Mayhem and tried to document the fact that both in the novel and specifically in the film, you have a crucial passage which relates the attempt to fight a sort of covert war on American society, and not just in New York, but all over America, to the sense of resentment of an in-between generation which are somehow denied greatness by where they're born into history. And I do find that relevant to both to Nietzsche's idea of slave morality and to Putin. I then here I'm way out of my comfort zone, try to summarize some of the sources of a sense of resentment in Putin about Russia's, I call it emasculation, because I found a very interesting YouTube, which I have referred to just above there, on the link between Fight Club and emasculation and Nietzschean theory. And I mean, the idea of emasculation and impotence, I've lost the slide again, I find really interesting. And then I do a bit of what the Soviets and the Chinese communists called self-criticism. I actually raised some big issues about how far you can generalize about the mood of a nation or the popular psychology. So I agree that it's quite dodgy, this. And I end up with references to three, I think, rather fruitful areas where resentment politics could be applied as a concept: North Korea, right-wing populism, and Islamism. And I point out as a sort of footnote that actually, in terms of the long-term political stability and genuine strength of Russia as a democracy or a member of the international community, Putin's systematic application of resentment politics is a very weak basis for long-term stability and strength. That actually he is actually creating a future problem by making his country depend on his charismatic or pseudo-charismatic politics and his way of using Machiavellian mischief as a substitute for being a genuine part of the international community. So that's my sort of overview of what I did. And I believe that Anton, we were talking earlier, already has at least one issue on which he'd like to take me up. So thank you very much. Over to Anton.
Yes, thank you very much, Roger. It's basically what I have, where I do have a problem is that, you see, the Soviet Union collapsed, and then it wasn't Putin who became immediately the leader of Russia. So we have at least 9 years of Russia, well, trying to at least, officially trying to become a liberal democracy. And if you look at the 90s, you will see that the economic situation was quite dire. This is true. But at the same time, the political liberties were there. Some would, of course, say that Yeltsin was still an authoritarian leader, that he basically destroyed democracy by, bombing the parliament in 1993. But still, the actual political pluralism was there. And also, when we are talking about politics of resentment, and I totally agree that Putin is using politics of resentment, but at the same time, I would say that for the Russian nation or for the Russian society, there was a lot of, how to put it, it was the perception that Russia was somehow humiliated. And this feeling of humiliation was, I think, it was incited by people around Putin. I wouldn't say that it was some organic feeling of the Russian society, because in the 90s, and again, despite the dire economic situation, this feeling of humiliation, it was not mainstream. It was on the fringes. It was among the communists, who obviously lost everything, and it was also among the rising fascist organizations. And at some point, there was even, especially in the 90s, there was even this combination of or political union, I would say, political alliance between Russian communists and Russian fascists. And there was this phenomenon of national Bolshevism. And to that alliance, experts would refer as red-brown coalition. And this very coalition was probably the most radical, probably not the most significant, but the most radical opposition to Yeltsin. So what Putin did is that he took the narratives of that red-brown coalition and he turned them mainstream. So they had all those politics of resentment already in the 90s. Communists would, complain about the loss of the Soviet greatness. The fascists were concerned with the loss of empire and what they believed was the humiliation of the Russian people in ethnic sense. But Yeltsin did not support this, and the state, the Russian state, was not promoting these politics of resentment at all. They were quite far from this, feeling of humiliation. They tried to do something else, and it was even only, I would say, with the rise of Putin, and especially closer to his end of his first term, so 2003, 2004, when he and his regime started, feeding into these politics of resentment. So where I would not necessarily disagree with you, but probably just to modify this a bit, is that this politics of resentment came later than the demise of the Soviet Union. And I would say only with Putin. So, 9 years before him, Russia was quite different still.
Okay, well, I'm sure I'm not going to disagree with any of that, of course, because I'm sure you're right. But I was focusing on really the fact that Putin did move the marginalized politics of resentment mainstream, but really the crucial thing, why, at least for a time, that made him extremely popular. I'm postulating a sort of resonance between his Eurasian vision of a special destiny for Russia and how he intensifies his sense that the West has let him down. And partly, from what I've understood, there was a sense in which, in that crucial 10 years, the West, instead of actually showing itself to be genuine friends of Russian democracy, they were very concerned to bring Russia into the sphere of hyper-capitalism, but they did very, very little in terms of intervention in the creation of a civil society. There was very little material help for Russia to make a transition to a functioning civil democracy. The similar thing happened in the transition from the GDR to integrating it into West Germany. Similar thing has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. The West is very bad at civil society, it seems to me. What interests me is that within about 5 years of Putin moving to resentment politics, Putin was extremely popular, as I understand it. And at some level, from what I hear from personal testimonies, he was seen as somebody who'd restored something about being Russian, that he'd compensated for something that was lost, despite the material problems, etc., and the obvious corruption. But anyway, I don't want to dominate this because I'm here to learn, but I take your point, basically.
Actually, I want to cite one American-Russian historian, Alexander Yanov, who basically said, in the 90s, almost, I think you're right. And here's a quote from him. "We plan to help build a free market in Russia, yet we have no plan about how to build democracy there. We think that democracy will build itself as a natural superstructure to the market economy. What if it doesn't? What if the free market is used as the foundation for an ugly and ominous Russian revanchism, authoritarian, militantly anti-Western and anti-democratic?"
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I just think that, unfortunately, it was Margaret Thatcher and her neoliberal allies who were in power at that time, and that dominated the way people saw democracy. If only Russia had collapsed in another context, maybe the syndrome of resentment and alienation from the West and the rise of Eurasianism, etc., would have been less pronounced. Anyway, what do I know? I'd really like to test drive this theory on other people who are listening. We've now got 32 participants, so I throw it open to anybody.
If I can talk for a while, thank you all for inviting me here. I just was listening about democracy and these concepts that it seems very different depending on the country and depending on the citizens of each country. If you talk to an American, they will talk to you about democracy in certain terms. It should be different from maybe Europeans. And this is sure and clear with Russians. If you talk to people and you ask them what democracy is, they should explain something else. But you see, the EU foreign minister went a few time ago to Russia to claim for the freedom of Mr. Navalny. And the concept that European people had, it was very different from the Russians. As Russians answered, well, you ask for Navalny freedom. We ask you for Catalan freedom. And all those people are jailed in Spain for defending the Catalan referendum. So in Europe, you can talk about democracy, but by staying, the oligarchy in the same place than has been always, and you come here to ask that we change our minds about democracy. So how do you see, I would like you to point about how do you see this difference about democracy in Russia and comparing it with US or, for instance, in UK or in Europe, right? Because it seems something is not, it's not matching here.
I think you're right. I think one of the weaknesses of the West, and we've encountered this a lot, is the charge of hypocrisy. For example, the Chinese state is saying, well, look how you treated the blacks, look at your civil rights record, etc. Who are you to attack the way we're treating minorities, etc. I always think there is a big, in the biblical terms, we have to take what's called in the Bible the mote out of our eye before we take the grain out of other people's eyes. I do think there's a major issue about how you conceive democracy. But the big thing about Putin's politics, which is very different from the Madrid politics, is its massive involvement there's no equivalent of the taking of Crimea and the covert involvement in Ukraine or the dirty tricks against critics of the regime, etc., etc., etc. I mean, the use of hacking, etc. I mean, Putin's regime is heavily involved in trying to destabilize the West, involvement in foreign elections, etc. You can make a parallel with the Catalan situation. I totally agree. But when you zoom back and see Putin's politics as a whole, it's of a very different level of Machiavellian duplicity and dirty tricks and attempts to use covert means to destabilize. So I do agree with your basic point about the ambiguity of democracy and the charge of hypocrisy, but I do think that scratches the surface of what a unique phenomenon Putinism is. I mean, that's my response, but I would love to hear other voices. I'm really fed up with my own voice. Yeah.
Perhaps the equivalent that comes to my mind to the conflict between the Spanish government and the Catalan separatism is the conflict between the Russian government and Chechen separatism. So with tens of thousands of civilians killed, actually, and Grozny made, to look similar to Stalingrad in 1943. So. I think there is obviously you can find lots of things in various Western states that are worth criticizing, but I would still think that the difference here is in quality, not just in quantity. And I'm also not aware that the Spanish government has been using chemical weapons material against its political opponents, or nuclear material, as it was the case with Alexander Litvinenko and polonium.
Yeah, the scale of barbarity and destruction is off the scale compared with any. I mean, you can compare it with some American involvements, and it could be compared, of course, with what the West did in Iraq, etc. I think it leads to a very big debate about foreign interventions on behalf of democracy and what Western powers have done. But that really gets away from I suppose what I'm really trying to test run with these experts who are in the virtual room now is whether the idea of resentment politics has any legs as a concept. As if you work through my talk, I acknowledge the fact there are various political science concepts that you can use, but I wondered if anybody found it enlightening or refreshing to see links, A, with Nietzsche, and which is philosophy, not political science, and B, with Fight Club, and whether that actually does enrich our feeling for what drives Putin, or is it just it's very clear that I did literature and not politics as my first degree.
There's now, of course, against the background of what you just said, Roger, a relatively large community of both Western and Russian commentators who have actually dared to call Putin's regime fascist, and the reference point here has been less so Nazism, but rather Italian fascism, and sometimes people then also refer to Franco or to other supposedly fascist regimes, and I just and there's now a book out even sort of responding to these discourses by Marlene Laurel, who is critical of this fascist designation of Putin's regime. But apparently there is a little bit of sort of connection between what you've studied before here, and but perhaps you could sort of elaborate on that and say where the line is. I'm also asking here for egotistic reasons, because I have to write a review of the book and to present, to be present at a book launch and to say something original. So I would be grateful for some ideas.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and the first premise I would like to establish is that, and I try to teach, or I used to when I was a teacher, try to teach my students to use this concept, and it's methodological pluralism. I don't believe that any one concept in any language can capture the complexity and richness of reality. So, and I could then do a long, boring excursus on Max Weber and ideal types and heuristic devices and all that sort of stuff. So I actually feel that every time you apply a concept in conjunction with other concepts, you illuminate another aspect of the phenomenon. So, for example, authoritarian, totalitarian, phallocracy, fascist, whatever, they all illuminate bits of a complex reality. So my answer would be, or to rephrase the question, is the concept fascism useful when looking at Putin's Russia? Well, I tell you what it does remind me of. It does remind me of one element of the Roger Griffin definition of fascism, which is, I keep telling people, is just an attempt. It's a heuristic device. It's not meant to be some sort of law to create a cult of Griffinism where everybody goes around quoting palingenetic ultranationalism. But one of the things I do with my theory of fascism is emphasize the importance of the rebirth myth. And of course, when Trump came to power talking about making Russia great again, you can form a mental link very easily with both Mussolini and Hitler trying to make their country great again after a perceived or real humiliation and loss of power, loss of empire. I mean, for Hitler, the decline had started with the miscegenation in the early modern period, which meant that the Germans lost their Aryan quality, and he was going to get all that back. Now, there definitely is something in the psychology of Putinism, which for me is very reminiscent of one ingredient of fascism, and it explains why what was interesting when you were saying that the Red-Brown alliance in the 90s was actually a crossover between elements of disenchanted or nostalgic communists with I've seen them on some wonderful videos, a sort of punk rock nationalism that you got with people using heavy music to celebrate Russia and Lenin, etc. Very, very weird stuff. So you get a sort of national Bolshevism, and they are definitely to do with rebirth and reawakening. But of course, the problem with that is that palingenesis. I remember when Tony Blair came to power in 1998, and the first thing he promised was a new spring. I mean, every time there's a change of regime, there's a new spring. So in itself, the idea of one, renewal, and two, making your country great again after perceived decline is not specific to fascism. What for me makes both Putin and Trump not fascist is the lack of a systematic program to get rid of all the structures of democracy and replace it with a new order which actually legitimizes totalitarian rule. I mean, for Mussolini, the word totalitario was a positive expression. And the first thing he did after he announced the end of liberal democracy in January 1925 was to literally dismantle the Galician state. Similarly with Hitler, the first thing they did when they got into parliament and after the Reichstag fire was to actually completely dismantle the Weimar state. So I don't see now, though Putin and Trump have tampered with constitutional democracy massively, and I see them as trying to create a wedge or a division between the liberal and the democratic. I mean, most people assume that liberal democracy is a single entity, but actually it's a binomial, and you can have democracy without liberalism. And in fact, Orban is proud of having turned Hungary into an illiberal democracy. So I see Putin much more in the camp of those populist leaders who actually are trying to deliberalize in the humanistic and civil rights and basic political freedoms sense democracy, but without going as far as actually creating a new order. So though I can understand the resonance, but there are some quite serious political scientists in America, not just the far left, who see Trump as a fascist. So I just think it's heuristically not very useful because it actually puts Putin in the wrong company, especially when you compare it with Nazism. Even in the case of Mussolini, Mussolini decided in 1917 that he was going to create a new Italy, get rid of liberal democracy, which he associated with decadence and weakness, and replace it with a new order. Now, Putin's new order, I don't see any real parallel with the creation of a fascist state. That's why I find, obviously this is narcissistic, but I find resentment politics more useful because Mussolini didn't just play dirty tricks with Western democracies. I mean, he got out of the League of Nations, he invaded Ethiopia, you could make parallels there with Putin, but he did so with this powerful myth of new Romans, of Romanità. I don't see Putin having the ideological sophistication of trying to evoke some sort of archetypal Russianness, which is a model for a constitutionally illiberal society. I see him creating a weird hybrid of constitutional democracy and the behavior of a modern statesman on the one hand and a sort of illiberal society on the other. Does that make some sort of sense?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
So yeah, I was wondering how you would articulate this notion of resentment depending on different power capabilities. So obviously you've brought up the Project Mayhem of Fight Club, right? But the thing that the group there can do is very different from what Putin can actually do. Cool. And I wonder to what extent his politics is conditioned by the fact that he knows that he and that Russia more generally can simply get away with it in the face of, the international community, which is still Western dominated, in ways in which other countries can't. Simply put, there would be probably a lot more resentment, but other countries, other leaders know they wouldn't be able to get away with it to the extent that Putin does. Can you factor this into your notion of politics of resentment?
Yeah, but are you suggesting that other political leaders would like to do the sort of thing that Putin does? I mean, what leaders do you have in mind? I don't even see Trump as attempting to create. I mean, by default, he created international mayhem through his totally schizoid, erratic mentality. But I don't see him sitting down and planning mayhem or setting his own hackers on other countries to try and destabilize elections or killing political opponents, etc. I just don't see him in the, what sort of leaders are you thinking of who would class as Machiavellian and only being limited in their malign politics by the fact that they're part of an advanced democracy? I mean, I can't think of anybody like that.
Well, it's not necessarily an advanced democracy, but one that I can think of quite easily would be Erdogan.
Erdogan, yeah.
But
absolutely.
He simply lacks the kind of power capabilities that Putin has at his disposal. I mean, Turkey is not Russia. For example,
let's take Erdogan. I mean, Erdogan's Turkey at one point wanted to get close to the EU with a view to membership, etc. I really don't see. I mean, Erdogan did dirty tricks with democracy and imprisoned a whole load of people on the pretext of the coup, etc. And he's got a very dangerous policy of re-Islamization, etc., etc., etc. But I really don't see him in the same category. I mean, people could help me on this. I don't see him as the same sort of psychological or foreign policy category. I don't see, even though there's a loss of Ottoman Empire, and you could have nostalgia for Ottoman greatness, and you could have a sort of resentment politics. I don't see Erdogan like that. I see him as deeply undemocratic in his mentality and quite megalomaniac in his own sense. But there's something deeply perverse. I mean, the open killing of foreign opponents in Salisbury, etc. I think this is extraordinary provocation. And then using the same terrible twins to blow up an arms dump in Czech Republic as in Salisbury, and then have them interviewed by Russia Today, doing a sort of Monty Python parody. You know, I just don't. This is really off the scale for me. It's almost farcical if it wouldn't be so sinister. So, even though you might draw, I don't see the constraining factor on resentment politics by other politicians. Just the fact that they couldn't get away with it. I actually think that he is particularly perverse in his mindset, in the way he sees his task. And well, that's my opinion. But again, I really would like other people to correct me, because this is where we all learn. Why did John not join us there? That's unfair of me, isn't it?
I didn't join because I didn't really have anything to say, but I have a question now, actually.
Yeah, please.
Couldn't some of, as you say, some of Putin's stunt, like Salisbury, seems almost absurd. Couldn't it also be a way to say that I do this to show you that I can do this? Yeah, I know it's absurd, but it's saying that, look, I can do this and you can't stop me.
Absolutely. No, it's sinister absurd. I mean, it's absurd in the sense that it's so transparent. I mean, it's this open and closed use of covert power that fascinates me about Putin. I mean, he in a way wants to be, he's more sinister in his propaganda and in his accumulation of I mean, if he wants to subvert democracy, to create a universal sense of insecurity, and that no opponent is beyond his reach, and that he's completely unbound by any moral imperative to play any sort of democratic game or respect any sort of treaties. And so look at the way he got involved in the Crimean and in Ukraine. And so I certainly don't mean by absurd the sense that it's laughable. I mean, I think it's sinister, but it's sort of it's almost as if he wants everybody to know that he knows that he's doing these things while he's actually denying that. And that I find peculiar to Putin. I mean, do correct me if I'm wrong. I can think of many evil people and people who use malign politics and people who commit all sorts of crimes of inhumanity. And you just have to think of people like Gaddafi or whatever. But officially, these things weren't happening and they were well hidden. And Putin doesn't even bother. He's even different in that sense from China, for example, which is actually saying, yeah, it's none of your business if we do certain things to certain populations. And that's not the same as Putin. So I wasn't trying, it's the wrong word, absurd. But it is like a black farce, you know. The whole Salisbury thing for me is really quite grotesque. To actually use polonium, I mean, polonium, if you're going to have a secret assassination, you don't use something, you don't actually have your spies going over there on a reconnaissance thing and then say they were there to look at the tallest tower in Churchtown. I mean, this is ridiculous, isn't it? And then to use the same people later, this is hardly, I'm still grasping for the right psychological category and political concept to actually characterize this stuff. I mean, I would love to, we've had the word fascism, we've got malign, we've got all these wonderful things. I hope people picked up on the fact that in French, there is a link between maligne, meaning malign, and malin. If you say somebody's malin, it means they're devious, that you can't trust them, that they're malicious, that they're using dirty tricks, that they're good at conning people. I mean, the psychological link between a certain type of evil, of malignity, and a certain type of behavior, which is devious and cunning, etc., I think is very significant that the language has picked up this affinity. I can't really think of other equivalents in the modern world. I can think of a lot of horrible dictator figures and people, but I can't think of anybody like Putin. For me, he's sort of in a category of his own.
I would like to ask Mr. Roger Griffin a question. Taking into account that you've mentioned before the fascist nature of Putin's regime, I'd like to address you the following question. Don't you think that this label would be rather a little bit too reductionist and sometimes a little bit too exaggerated? Because even if there are pro-arguments here, I would argue that hybrid is a better label. Why? Because there are very specific practices for Putin's regime that actually I haven't found them so far in other types of fascist regimes, like the practice of hypocrisy, you know, letting the people from your apparatus to act on their own as long as they follow your orders. Basically, the practice of not constraining your people, the practice of karmlenie and obshchak, which I don't really find them characteristic for a fascist regime. So basically, what do you think about this aspect? I think that the label of fascism, or the label of fascist as characteristic for Putin's regime, I don't think it might seem very suitable. I think it might be very reductionist and maybe sometimes outdated. I'm not so sure about the perfect word here, but I would like to answer your answer as well. Thank you.
Well, of course, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that fascism is not the appropriate word. I've argued this quite a lot in various lectures and an article for The Independent in England. But this is partly because of a massive confusion within the general use of the word fascist between the Marxist theory of fascism and the liberal democratic or liberal academic theory, and of course the loose usage in mass media and in social media. I mean, for example, if you read, and I get a Google alert every time the word fascism is used. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I tell you, it's gone up massively. But I get lots of reports from India. In India, in the anti-Hindutva, anti-Modi press, the word fascism is used constantly. Now, Modi, according to my reading of history and political science, is absolutely not a fascist, but he's definitely what I would call a good example of illiberal democracy. He demonizing the Muslim population, his handling of the coronavirus epidemic and of the farmers, etc., points to all sorts of totally dysfunctional government, which is blind to the needs of his own people. The way he's encouraged a super rich capitalist class and neglected the Indian infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. He's a terrible, terrible prime minister, but he's still a prime minister. And until he abolishes the elections, Putin extended his presidency, but he hasn't abolished the institution of president. I mean, he's done everything he can but abolish it, but he's done this typical sort of Machiavellian, I mean, it's not even parallel to what Hitler did with the Enabling Act, the Ermächtigungsgesetz, after the Reichstag's fire, where he actually gave himself the constitutional freedom to do what he liked, which of course is ridiculous because it's just like an Orwellian doublethink. You know, he makes lack of democracy democratic. But Modi is a very, very bad, non-democratic in his personality politician, but he's still operating within a democratic system. And though there are pressures on opponents, etc., there's still a relatively free press, and there are all sorts of. He doesn't have private prison camps, and he's not torturing people, etc., etc. So I think the word fascism really, really should be. I mean, it can be used as an expletive. I can say it in a conversation when I've had too much vodka, which I don't drink, Putin's a bloody fascist, etc. But that is a colloquialism. That's an expletive. It's not a term of political science. And I don't think it's a very helpful term used like that. And I'd say exactly the same thing about Trump. There was a massive tendency, especially from the left and certain liberal media, to call Putin, Trump a fascist, but the same argument applies. Trump did not attempt to, he wanted a second term, but I see no evidence that he wanted to actually destroy the American Constitution, to which he was paradoxically committed as part of his own pseudo-American commitment to American values. You know, making America great again did not involve going back to a pre-liberal democratic America and destroying human rights. So I do think these terms are absolutely useless. I still struggle to find a proper characterization. I mean, I was quite happy when I came across this lovely term, maskirovka, what is it, Anton? Yeah,
Maskirovka.
well, I think it's great. Maskirovka. Now, when I found that term, I thought, great, the Russians have a word for it. And when I read about decoy tanks and trying to pretend that you're stronger than you are, but through the use of deception, and the fact that it's a very ancient sort of military tactic, I found this wonderful. But of course, it doesn't capture everything. I don't think it captures, unless you extend the idea of masks to things like illegal killing of compatriots abroad using spies and things which you send over on planes where their journey can be tracked, etc. I don't think it captures it. I like many of the concepts. I like malign politics. What I'm suggesting, therefore, in a shorthand, is that we see Putin as I'd like a really good article to be written by an expert, which teaches me a lot, which says Putin is an enigma, not only psychologically, psychodynamically, but also in terms of how we characterize him, with how we locate him, with, you know, is he unique? There was a big debate once. Was Nazism unique? Can it be caught within the concept of fascism or totalitarianism, etc.? Well, of course, everything is both unique and part of something generic. I would suggest an armory of different concepts which sort of overlap with each other to characterize Putin. I don't think resentment politics captures it all, but I suggest it as an enrichment of the conceptual armory that we have, that we don't use totalitarian, we don't use Nazi, we don't use fascist, we don't just use psychopath or psycho or whatever. I think he's much more intelligent in my terms than Trump, for example, and much more devious. But I do find it strange that people haven't read sometimes Machiavelli. There's an awful lot of Machiavelli in the mistrust of enemies, the idea that, I mean, the passage I quoted is just one. I mean, the whole tone of Machiavelli is that about know your enemies, keep your enemies close, all this sort of stuff. I think Putin, the way he played Trump was extremely clever, actually. I think he not only tried to help Trump get elected, how effectively or not, I don't know, but once he was in power, he played it very cleverly, like a game of chess, to ensure that Trump did maximum damage to American democracy. And I think he's doing that with the subsidizing of fascist and neo-Nazi groups in Europe and a whole load of other examples of this. So I think he escapes characterization, and that he's underestimated I think there is a sort of method in his madness. My last slide is really saying, but ultimately it's self-defeating. I don't think Putin can be followed, and I think he's doing a lot of damage to his own country. And there is a sort of democratic reawakening now crystallized around the Navalny affair, and that in the long term, Putin is going to be history, as it were. And I just pray that paradoxically, the very lack of democracy in Russia will create a powerful movement for democracy eventually, and that maybe this time the West could be more proactive in encouraging it in various ways, materially and in terms of healthy networking. That's my sort of stand.
We have a question from Anna Gritsenko. Anna?
Thank you, everybody, for this discussion. Maybe my analogy is too psychological, but still, maybe it can be useful. Well, speaking about how we in Ukraine experience this Putin's aggression from on the receiving side, we sometimes tend to categorize it as something similar to a school bullying, when you can just yes.
Yeah, go on.
When you can just give him whatever he wants, you can just subordinate to him and his demands, but instead of it, he even gets more and more aggressive, like more and more interested in it. What do you think about this analogy? Can it be like useful in any way?
Well, absolutely. I mean, actually, if you look at the psychology of bullying, it's always associated with weakness. I don't know if you noticed, but on the slide I produced, I've got to point out that I quoted what was her name again, Anton? Can you read out that quote on my slide?
Grudina, Violeta Grudina. She's within Navalny movement in Russia.
And what does she say? Can you see the quote?
1 moment. Destroying your political opponent is not a sign of strength. It shows that Putin is weak and that he is a coward.
Yeah. And I would add to that the word bully. I think if you look at the psychology of bullying, it is nearly always a sign of an inner sense of weakness, of a very disturbed state of immaturity, of resentment, of envy, of taking it out on weaker people who can't answer back. But of course, again, the problem with that, I would happily add the idea of political bullying to the list of different attempts to conceptualize Putin, except that in contrast to a lot of bullies, he's also very clever in a way in his bullying. I mean, a lot of bullies just have to be confronted with a superior force and they crumble. But he actually, bullying is just one of his tactics. He also has other tactics which are much more devious. I mean, his use of denial or his use of soldiers without uniforms, etc. You know, this is, again, doesn't quite belong just straightforward to a bully. I mean, if he's a sort of sociopath, sociopaths can be very, very clever. Some bullies are just sort of literally playground bored young adolescents who enjoy the sense of power that they don't really have and take it out on weaker people. But he doesn't only do that, you know, his use of the military in Chechnya, etc., etc., etc. I mean, you know, so yes, Hannah, I would happily add bullying to the attempt to capture his particular psychology and how it translates itself into politics. But I do think he's so maybe I've been drawn into his negative charisma. Maybe I'm attributing to him more cleverness than, but if you read Machiavelli, the prince is not stupid. This is not advice to a stupid pupil. This is advice to a clever pupil who has power, but precisely because he's got power, has to be warned about the traps of power and what your enemies will do to you if you don't watch your back. Putin is always watching his back. And I think that it reminds me of an unequal game. You know, that Western democracy is so unused to somebody like Putin that they don't know how to read him. So, I mean, similarly, when Trump went to North Korea, he thought he'd got a deal, but he just didn't understand the mentality of North Korea. So I think the West has systematically done two things. A, is misread and underestimated Putin, who I think is actually much more astute than he seems, and actually more evil than he seems. He's not a buffoon, he's not a clown. Jester, by the way, when I use that image of the Jester film, it's not because he's a stupid clown, he's an evil clown, and that's different. But also I think the West has underestimated what you need to create a democracy. I think the attempt to encourage neoliberal economics in Russia without supplementing that with a heavy dose of civil society involvement at every level was a disaster, and it has been in other arenas as well. And I think that's the blind spot of power politics and the blind spot of having foreign policy very much driven by the military. I mean, the Cold War was not just a military confrontation, it was a clash of two totally different concepts of civilization. And I don't think people realize the trauma for millions of Russians when that system that they were told was superior to a collapsing capitalism actually collapsed. It left a huge psychological vacuum, not just a power vacuum and an economic catastrophe. There was, as with Weimar Germany, it left psychological trauma. And I think we've massively underestimated the role of humiliation and trauma in the shift from the Soviet Union to a modern democratic Russia. But I'd love some comments on that.
I was wondering if you've considered any of Nietzsche's statements about Europe and Russia, since they're actually, I think, very compatible with your analysis, and they're also very interesting in relation to the present moment because there are a lot of similarities. I said a bit more about it in my comments there. I don't know if you've had a chance to read them.
Yeah. Oh, well, I haven't, I'm afraid, because I've been talking too much. But I would be very interested to follow that up. Yeah, I mean, as you saw in my presentation, I specifically linked Ressentiment to slave morality, and I haven't. How interesting! No, I don't know that. The great spirit, the great politics. Very interesting. No, I plead guilty to not knowing my own Nietzsche. I do think Nietzsche, by the way, there's quite a lot. There's a sort of fan club of online of Fight Club. There's a lot. There's a sort
of. It's a great. Yeah.
There's a groupie subculture of people online loving Fight Club, and some of the more intellectual among them constantly invoke Nietzsche. So there's something. It's not just me that sees this resonance. And I would be very happy to follow that up. I mean, I would love one of the fruits of my talk not to be me writing, because I just don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to Russia. But what I would love to see is somebody having another go at conceptualizing Putin's politics with a slightly broader waveband of both conceptualization and literary explorations of certain types, because I think creative literature and creative forms of psychodrama and stuff in literature and fiction can be as illuminating. I mean, for example, I think Dostoevsky massively contributes the understanding of the growth of late 19th century politics. I mean, his study of the underground man, for example, which I think is an incredible text, the resentment of underground man who hates progress and really is on the verge of becoming a terrorist, if you read it retrospectively. If you see Dostoevsky's fascination with Nechayev and how that comes into The Devils, for example. Nechayev, though Dostoevsky ended up as a sort of fundamentalist Eurasian Christian, he was deeply fascinated by murder and mayhem and death and terrorism. And he was just across the borderline between being a supercharged Russian intellectual novelist on the one hand and a sort of activist terrorist on the other. And I think this sort of crisis of being Russian, Russian nihilism in the mid to late 19th century, and Turgenev and all this sort of stuff, there's actually some wonderful study to be made of the Russianness of Putin as a product of a very special Russian culture of decadence and rebellion against the West, and a sort of hatred, love-hate with the West, which goes right back to the 19th century. Now, again, I can't read Russian. I've never studied Russian literature, but I would love somebody who has. My life's been too full of other things in the West. But I hope that makes sense to you. Does that make sense to you a little bit, Gregory, what I've just said?
What I find so interesting about this is that when Nietzsche does kind of reconceptualize master morality and slave morality in political terms, he comes back to Europe and Russia. Yeah. And what he ends up saying about politics in that context, or the way he refines his understanding of master morality, he dispenses with the violence, the actual violent war, and he focuses on a war of ideas, right? He envisions like a point where Russia may become such a threat that Europe will have to unite. Yeah. And it'll end up being led by this transracial cast of these cultural geniuses who will plan thousands of years in advance and manage to lead Europe into the future and establish superior values. And it's very interesting to consider in relation to the present moment. And it totally agrees with how you associate resentment politics with what Putin has been doing for the past.
Yeah, except can I qualify that? Because I see Putin almost as the opposite of this great agonistic struggle between years, because in a way he's kept his own worldview. I mean, what he specifically hasn't done is create some great sophisticated Eurasianist theory, which is an alternative to Western democracy. I mean, in a way, he's though he's been influenced by it, and it's interesting that Nietzsche was very impressed by Dostoevsky, for example, and that's probably where he gets the idea. Even the Russian own myth of itself is that it's got this thing called dusha, which is not what the West has got, sort of civilization. It's a bit like the German attack on French civilization in the name of Kultur. Well, the idea that Dostoevsky and Eurasianists have, that Russia is somehow deeper than the West, that the West is oberflächlich, is superficial. You know, this is all fascinating. But what gets me about Putin is that instead of in a Superman sort of Übermensch sort of way promulgating and announcing this alternative worldview, which is superior, culturally superior, he doesn't. He sort of leaves his own commitment to some alternative worldview a sort of mystery. Now, nobody quite knows what he's doing. And that's very un-Nietzschean. I mean, Nietzsche said that he was dynamite and he was 1,000 miles above, up in the air, and that history would be divided by Nietzsche. There'd be before Nietzsche and after Nietzsche. I mean, now Putin may be arrogant, but he's never presented himself as some sort of great political Superman in a way. I mean, even Hitler was far more ready, and Mussolini. And that's my point. Hitler and Mussolini were part of master morality, quite specifically. In fact, Nietzsche influenced Mussolini specifically, and Nietzsche and Hitler claimed to be influenced by Nietzsche, though it's not clear that he read him, but he certainly liked Wagner. So I do think this is where we get the difference, that's why I think resentment politics is useful, because it actually shows that though Putin is part of some great struggle between Russia and the West, and I think it is if you look at people like Alexander Dugin, well, he doesn't come clean again. He doesn't stand up for it in the master morality style. He actually uses slave morality in being different from the West. Does that make sense?
I think what most scholars of Nietzsche would say today is that neither Hitler nor Mussolini realized any form of master morality. All of their understanding of Nietzsche was based on kind of bastardized text by his sister. But it's kind of an ambiguous
but it wasn't a real master morality. But they both, the Nazi myth of Herrenmensch.
Oh, yeah, it was in the image of it, but it was kind of.
And the fascist myth of Romanità and Roman, these are like parodies of Nietzsche. Never liked nationalism, and he was never anti-Semitic, blah blah blah.
Oh, yeah,
so I totally agree with you. But in their way, they were like political parodies of a master morality. What they didn't do is what Putin does, where he's in a way he is a sort of mystery, like a black hole. I mean, I don't think you can really work out what he hasn't written some Mein Kampf or some tract that makes it clear what he is, and that's part of his power in a way.
I think there's enough ambivalence between certain elements of master and slave morality that you can kind of get confused about which
is which
you're actually looking at. Is this master morality or slave morality? Because slave morality does, after all, invert master morality. It kind of masquerades as like a different version of it, right? But there's distinctive, very distinctive differences between the two. Like master morality is created; it wants to create something superior. Slave morality wants to kind of, right?
Yeah.
So in that way, I think both Hitler and Mussolini were closer to slave morality was because he felt threatened by the Jews and so on.
Yeah. Okay.
Interestingly, Nietzsche in those notebooks, one of his strangest ideas, he imagines breeding Teutonic knights with Jewish financiers, and he thinks then he would produce this transracial cultural caste.
I think he really had a very weak reality principle by the end, and I don't think the syphilis helped, and the sense of
it was one of his strange.
Nevertheless, I still think he was onto something about the war against nihilism, etc. I just wondered. I'm aware of the fact that people are being very patient.
Let's have a question from John.
Yeah, I've been a bit. We are now talking very much about what Putin does. I mean, don't we, in order to really understand or try to analyze it, have to have an idea or a theory of what he wants to achieve? I mean, let's look at Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, they both wanted to do something. I mean, Mussolini wanted New Rome, or Hitler wanted to recreate the pure German race nation, create a 1,000-year Reich.
Yeah.
Don't we, if we are to analyze Putinism, so to say, don't we need to have a theory of what it wants to achieve? And do we have such a theory?
Well, my answer to that is I think that's part of his, what I call resentment politics, is he doesn't disclose any end goal. And I think there's been a lot of, I think it's almost a feature of the sort of the bully, the deviant. I mean, I don't think he's Machiavellian with an aim to achieve something. I think in his own way, he's fighting a battle against to prop up the illusion that Russia is great again under him. I mean, in a way, he's tried to do what Trump promised to do with his 4 years or 8 years, which is to make Russia, to give Russian citizens a sense of greatness, to compensate. I called it at one point a compensatory myth. I think this is another psychological concept which is relevant here, is the idea of compensation, psychological compensation. I mean, there's a whole literature about compensation, that you can't get one thing, so you do something else. You can't get a proper, respected, prosperous democracy together with the normal criteria for an advanced capitalist democracy. So you take Russia, you take Crimea by stealth. So it's like a compensation. In football commentaries, there's this idea of it's a compensation goal. It's a goal which it gives you a momentary sense of pride when you've actually lost the match, and so that use of the word compensation. So I would actually find it very surprising if he had a long-term. That really would be a sign of non-slave morality if he had a long-term goal that he was actually achieving in some roundabout way. I mean, that's why I pointed to the ultimate failure of his politics, because I can't see how it can be perpetuated after his death or when he runs out of extensions to his presidency. I mean, at the end of the day, mortality will deal with him. Now, you can't say that about China. You can't say that about Korea. Socialist societies like the Catholic Church have a built-in mechanism for self-perpetuation. They have a ritual that creates a new leader. I don't know how Russia is going to deal with his loss. What I would like to see is, of course, a powerful democratic movement that overthrows him. I mean, for me, that would be absolutely bloody fantastic. And they give the Crimea back, and they stop bullying and killing, and embrace the joys of democracy. And I think there's a generational factor here. I think there's a whole new generation of people growing up who would actually welcome that, because one thing you can't do in the modern multimedia age is actually block out awareness of the West, like you could under Soviet Russia at one point. But I do agree with you, but I don't agree with you that you can't use my concept if you don't know what he wants. Either he's being devious about what he wants, and that's consistent with resentment politics, or he's using resentment politics to paper over, as we say, a fundamental nihilism, a black hole of lack of any real politics here. And that it's a bit like bread and circuses. He's an illusionist. That's another concept, that he's creating illusions of power without any real substance, with a modern version of a mixture of propaganda and terror. There's a sort of democratic terror and democratic propaganda. It's not directly comparable to Nazism or Stalinism, but it's still the basic weapons of social engineering with only a fig leaf democracy. And I'm hoping that eventually he is seen through, like the Wizard of Oz, and you have a big movement of people wanting to sort of, or the Hans Christian Andersen tale of the emperor's new clothes, that he is naked, and the king, and it's the child who sees that the emperor's got nothing on, and only these flatterers and creeps have sold him this wonderful material that only refined people can see. And there's, in the American musical song, the king is in the altogether, the altogether, the altogether. Altogether means naked. And ultimately, Putin is naked. I haven't seen that in the cartoons, but he is a sort of an emperor without clothes, ultimately, if he hasn't got some what we call in English comedy a cunning plan. That's a reference to a famous program in England called Blackadder. I mean, there's this guy who's always got a cunning plan, which always fails. So in a way, pushing that, if you can take your mind off all the inhumanities course, he's a sort of tragicomic figure. I mean, he's a pathetic figure, but who's simultaneously terrifying because he's using resentment politics to compensate for his ultimate impotence and lack of ideas.
I guess you could argue that that's becoming more visible since, I mean, to me it appears that whatever goals he had has largely kept failing.
Yeah, I think so. But again, wouldn't it be lovely? I would like to see in a couple of years' time a brilliant article by Russianologists or whatever they're called who actually have another go. I think Anton's article was excellent. I would love somebody to do something. I've seen a lot of stuff on Putin, but I don't find a lot of the stuff on Putin very sophisticated psychologically or conceptually. I mean, it's thinly veiled anti-Putin propaganda, or it has a cathartic effect, but I don't see it, as a political scientist, very concerned about the dynamics of fascism, which I spend a long time trying to sort out. I would love to have another lifetime to learn Slav languages and Russian and have a look at Putin, but I haven't got that. But and maybe there's a brilliant book in Ukrainian or Russian, but I mean, I have not yet seen a really good account of Putin. I've seen fragments of and maybe that's all we can ultimately have with somebody like Putin. I mean, I think Kant called it proper legamina or something. So the sort of preparatory thoughts on the way towards a theory of Putin. But of course, in a way, this is all wrong because somebody as trivial as Putin does not deserve so much intellectual effort in a way. And maybe we should ultimately say he's not worth it. But I found him intriguing anyway. And I thought the idea of trying to link Putin with, I think, a brilliant film about modern nihilism called Fight Club, I thought, and the Project Mayhem. I mean, for people who haven't seen it, see the film, you'll see the links. The translation of a fundamental sense of hatred of modern society and what it's done to you, and resentment of capitalism and consumerism, and this decision to fight a war which involves blowing up, which was done for a different ideology a decade later in 9/11. I just found that really resonant, an extraordinary intersection between the creative imagination, reading modern nihilism of a lost generation, and the Al-Qaeda attack on Western capitalism. I found this so resonant, quite extraordinary, that it's somehow encoded in there as a mental space for 9/11. And in a way, I just think if political scientists would spend a little bit more time on literature, even on Russian literature, they'd get some wonderful handles on some of the more difficult areas of psychopathology that we're dealing with when we're dealing with people like Erdogan or Putin or Assad or whatever. You know, these people are also, in their complicated ways, sociopaths in a way. They're people who accumulate power for inhuman ends with a sense of entitlement and innocence, which I find humanistically fascinating. And I think Dostoevsky, a modern Dostoevsky, could write some brilliant pages about what's going on in there. Maybe
Roger, if I may,
rounding it up.
Yeah, let me, closer to the end, let me ask this, because this is something that was already brought up. Whether leaders can learn from Putin, or at least European leaders. And I'm thinking about Viktor Orban, because if you look at him and how he, after his return to power in 2010, I think in many ways he tried to mimic Putin, or at least he used some of the aspects of politics of resentment. For example, I'm not a specialist on Hungarian politics, but I think I would not be entirely incorrect if I said that the Treaty of Trianon was not really such a big thing before Viktor Orban came to power in 2010. That it was just a marginal narrative about that we lost the Greater Hungary, that we need to somehow revive the idea, and this is where you could feed these two people and produce this feeling of humiliation, of lost something, and then you can exploit this feeling. You first create it and then you exploit it. Yeah. And again, if you look at how Orban learned from Putin, you would see that first there were in Russia there were repressions against independent universities, and then the CEU was gone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then Putin's regime adopted a law against foreign NGOs, calling them foreign agents, and then Orban's regime adopted something very, very similar. So you still see those parallels, and probably I do agree that probably you can't really learn everything from Putin's regime, but some elements you can definitely learn from him and implement.
Well, I think it goes further than that. Hungarism was the official title of Chavez's fascism in the wartime period, and the Hungarian myth of its uniqueness within Europe and the fact that it's not really European, that it's got this unintelligible language, etc. All that it has parallels with Eurasianism, that they're not really European. I think that's really important part of it. The sense of their specialness, the sense that European laws of democracy don't apply to Hungarians because they can't really be understood by the West. I think that's very interesting. Also, the sense that you can sort of have it both ways. You can be a member of the EU and accept all their subsidies and money, and yet you can be selective about what you accept from the West. That sort of the sense that you can actually milk the West for some things, and but also the Trianon myth leads to this spirit of irredentism, that you've got to get back bits of what was yours. Well, that's very parallel in Russia, that the idea that the loss of the Soviet Empire, the attempt to somehow reclaim the Russified elements within the Baltic states and Ukraine, etc. I find all this is all symptomatic of this sense of somehow somebody's come along, and it's a bit like you're living in a house and somebody builds something in your back garden, and suddenly you feel that you've been invaded by somebody else's sense of entitlement, and you've got to get your own back. And getting your own back, of course, we're back to the bully. The idea that your use of inhuman power is legitimized because someone has taken something away from you in an arbitrary way. So I do think there are big parallels there between Orban. And what I like about Orban, though, is that in a way he's not doesn't seem to me to be driven by slave morality, because he's so absolutely overt about, when he gives a speech saying, I am proud of the fact that we have created an illiberal democracy, I'm almost waiting for Putin to come out with that sort of clarity. You see, Orban for me it sort of celebrates, the way he sponsored Jobbik and Fidesz and these parties, etc. The way he actually orchestrated Hungarian society and mobilized people against Jews and Sinti, and put barbed wire around his nation to keep out refugees. I don't think there was much covert about that. I think that was quite a provocation of the West and of Europe in a way which is overt. And what I'm interested in is it's this word covert, couvert. Underhand, under the table, sort of surreptitious. There's some lovely words in English, surreptitious. I don't think there's anything surreptitious about Orban. So though there are some interesting parallels, maybe a good article would do a sort of compare and contrast, like in a school essay, Orban and Putin, because there's some fascinating. But for example, Orban makes more of the parallels with Putin than Putin does with Orban. I haven't come across Putin actually being proud of a relationship with Hungary, but I have seen references to Hungary invoking Putin, for example, and I find that really fascinating. So yeah, I would still, in my arrogance, say that there's mileage in resentment politics, that it is actually quite specific. It's not, though you can see elements of the behavior and ideology in other countries and other leaders, it's this particular nastiness, underhandness, going behind your backness, betrayal, traditore. It's like having a good friend who suddenly goes off with your girlfriend or something. It's your sort of you can't trust them. I mean, Putin has made a sort of style of politics out of being completely out of being inscrutable, of having machinations where you're not even quite sure what he's trying to do. I mean, it's overt that he uses hacking. I feel it's really clever. I mean, I don't think people know as much about North Korean hackers as we do about the Department of Hacking in Russia's Kremlin, for example. So I find it's this displaying your unreliableness by while at the same time covering it up. I find that really, really peculiar to Putin, and I'd like to be corrected on that. And even when though I make parallels with ISIS and North Korea, well, North Korea more, ISIS is quite upfront about what they're doing. I mean, they have an ideology, they have tactics, etc., etc. But it's terrorism is the weapon of the weaker. It's what you do. You know, you machine gun a theatre in Paris, the Bataclan, because you can't bomb them and you can't fight an open war with them. So it's the sort of resentment politics. But even so, Putin has a special twist on resentment politics with his deviousness. I feel that we should be drawing it up. I'm very impressed by so many people who've sat there listening without being involved, and I'm sorry I've tended to dominate the discussion, but it's been very interesting for me.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you indeed. I mean, it was a fascinating discussion, and thank you to the audience for all those questions. I think we could go on, but
yeah, I'm sure
we need to.
Can I just say that if people are not annoyed or happy and want to email me and take me up on points or put me onto good articles or books or whatever, please feel free, because I'm a sort of débutant in this. I'm learning Putinese. Yeah. There's a special dish in Italy called puttanesca, which means not from Putin, but puttana, meaning a prostitute. And I think there should be that you could do a nice pun sometimes on his sort of politics being that of you know, associated with puttana, but that would again trivialize the whole thing. And I do look forward to some good articles that I can actually read in English, which take up this cause. A short answer to what you raised just now was, I think that leaders should really maybe read Machiavelli and be less surprised when people play dirty tricks, and stop trying to fit foreign leaders into their liberal democratic Western intellectual concepts. I mean, you know, I don't see why was the British government surprised that it had Russian spies from Cambridge in the secret services? You know, why do we assume that if you've been to Oxbridge you are a British patriot? That is just called being stupid. And I think there's a lot of stupidity in the way professional observers of other leaders and other states assume that there's a natural default in human nature to democracy. Democracy is A, very questionable in terms of its own human rights and foreign policy record, and B, is only one form of modern politics. And we shouldn't be surprised if you can actually have something like China, which is an advanced technological power and military power, not based on democratic humanistic assumptions. So I do think it's a shame that it's quite often mediocre products of universities who go into state roles as advising people on Russia, etc. Nobody picked up in the Pentagon that the Berlin Wall was falling down. I mean, there were lots and lots of observers of GDR that said it was about to collapse, but nobody picked it up. So I think, yeah, leaders should get better advisors. They haven't got times themselves, but they should get a little bit more information from NGOs like yours, Anton. Okay?
Yes, again, thank you very much, Roger. And there is a question, there are two questions, and let's be very brief. People ask about the email. May I put it on the website?
Absolutely. Please put my email on the website. And I do have a, you know, you can find me quite easily, but do advertise it.
Yeah. And then there is a question about slides. Well, they are already on our website. So yeah. Okay. So thank you again. Thank you, everybody, and see you next time. Bye.
Okay. So 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone.